Entering Frome's kitchen, the narrator is unable to tell which of the two women in the room had been speaking upon the man's arrival. Both are slight and gray-haired, and one starts preparing the evening meal as the other sits huddled in the corner by the stove. The narrator observes the marked poverty and squalor of the place, and Frome notes the coldness of the room with a tone of apology. The woman in the corner attempts to explain, blaming the other woman for having only just started the fire. The narrator then recognizes the whining voice he heard previously as the voice of the seated woman. As the other woman comes back around to the table to set a pie in place, Frome introduces her to the narrator as his wife and then proceeds to introduce the seated woman as Miss Maddie Silver. The next morning, the narrator returns to his lodgings, to the great relief of Mrs. Hale, who had given him up for dead. Mrs. Hale and her mother, Mrs. Varnum, are most surprised to learn of Frome's exceeding generosity toward the narrator, and they react with downright amazement at his announcement that he has spent the night at the Frome household. The narrator senses a strong hint of curiosity in the two women regarding Frome's hospitality. Mrs. Hale submits that she has spent a great deal of time visiting the Fromes, but for the last 20 years hardly anyone but herself and their doctors has ever set foot in the household. After supper, Mrs. Varnum retires for the evening, and Mrs. Hale and the narrator sit in the parlor for a further conversation about the Fromes. Mrs. Hale begins to recount the terrible aftermath of the smash-up, but the mere memory of Maddie's convalescence suffices to bring her to tears. Gathering her wits, Mrs. Hale continues with her tale, describing to the narrator Zena's mysteriously silent reaction to the events and her gracious decision to receive Maddie back into their household as soon as she could be moved. Responding to the narrator's gentle queries, Mrs. Hale explains that Maddie has lived with the Fromes ever since and that Zena has done much of the caretaking for the three of them. Expressing pity for them and marveling at their resilience, Mrs. Hale seems to have concluded her account. However, she then collects herself to make one final remark. Removing her spectacles and leaning toward the narrator in confidence, she declares in a lowered voice that Maddie would have been better off dying after the accident, for, as it stands, I don't see there's much difference between the Fromes up at the farm and the Fromes down in the graveyard. Except that down there they're all quiet, and the women have got to hold their tongues. In this brief epilogue, Wharton summons us back to the present, resuming the narrator's description of his visit to the Frome household. The result is an abrupt and curtailed view of Frome's plight, of which we now hold a background understanding. As she did in the novel's opening scenes, Wharton once again delays the revelation of character, describing the individuals at hand before she names them. From the neutral narrator's description, it is initially difficult to tell which woman is which, and when we hear that one speaks in a whine, the word Wharton uses earlier to describe Zena's voice, we assume that this complainer is Zena only to realize, with a trace of horror, that the voice belongs to Maddie. Thus, everything comes full circle, and the cyclical nature of life on the farm is embodied in the terrible fate of Ethan and the women. Instead of finding escape in suicide, he and Maddie have ended up in a state of living death, in which all Maddie's vitality has been leached away, and she has transformed into a carbon copy of her former opposite, Zena. Zena herself, appropriately enough, has been restored to greater health by the necessity of caring for her disabled husband and cousin as if she can be healthy only when others suffer. Certain aspects of the characters have remained constant throughout. All was quiet and inscrutable. Zena remains impossible to interpret, and the reader is left ignorant of her opinions about the situation. Nobody knows Zena's thoughts, Mrs. Hale says, and the text confirms that her pale opaque eyes reveal nothing and reflect nothing. Nonetheless, one can imagine her taking a kind of perverse delight in the failure of Ethan and Maddie's attempt to escape her, as well as in the brutal justice of their fate.